As always, it's a pleasure to be here at Beit Abichai. I'd like to spend just a moment, pause for a moment, just to explain the title of the series. We clearly can't cover all of Polish Jewish history in 4 sessions, so we are going to deal with the very beginning and a couple of the chapters right before the end of Polish Jewish history. I called the series Strangers, Neighbors, Citizens, Polish Jewry in History and Historiography, because that's the way I look at the Polish-Jewish relationship, the attitude of Poles toward Jews and Jews toward their situation in Poland, sometimes as strangers, sometimes as neighbors, and sometimes as citizens. And I'm not talking about a kind of sequential change from one to the other, but rather all 3 of these aspects of the Polish-Jewish reality intermix with each other in each period and never really disappear from the scene, including in the present day. But that we might leave till the last of our sessions. Today we're dealing with beginnings. I called this lecture tonight Folklore, Myth, Reality, and Politics, the Origins of Polish Jewry. Stories of origin are always of interest. If we just think of our own education, whether here in Israel or in the States, we grew up with stories of origin. The Pilgrims coming to Massachusetts in 1620, or those of us who grew up in the American Jewish educational system, the 23 Jewish refugees from Brazil who made their way to New Amsterdam to a not always warm welcome. The stories about the origins of this country, Israel, where one origin story is countered by another counter-narrative, both of them focused on the same day in 1948, one a day of triumph and one a day of disaster. And if we think about the arguments in the States in recent years, stories of beginnings are very crucial in the debate about how history should be taught, should be learned, and should be passed on. Just a slight difference of 1 year between the 1620 of the Pilgrims and the 1619 of the so-called 1619 Project, which centers on the notion of slavery coming to North America. Both of these origin stories present a totally different view of how history should be regarded, how the American nation should regard itself. So it shouldn't be surprising to us that Jewish communities in other places also had origin stories. And probably the most developed and variegated is that of the origins of the Jews of Poland, which is our topic today. Perhaps the most complete and also eloquent in his own way version of the story of the origins of Polish Jewry was given by none other than Shai Agnon. And actually there are at least 3 or 4 versions of this story, 2 in Hebrew, 2 in German. But let us focus for our purpose today on the first one that was published in Hebrew in 1919 in the journal called HaTekufa. And let's follow along with this story to see the nuances of what the beginnings of Polish Jewry is supposed to mean. The story is called Polin. Gentle Polin, Poland, ancient land of Torah and learning, from the day Ephraim had first departed from Judah. That's a rhyme. And this comes from a slicha, a penitential poem by Rabbi Moshe Katznarl of the exiles of Poland, head of the Beit Din of the Holy Congregation of Metz. He was one of the exiles, refugees, after the Khmelnytsky massacres in 1648, 1649. But this is the story. We did not know But our fathers told us how the exiles of Israel came to the land of Poland. When Israel saw how its sufferings were constantly renewed, oppression increased, persecutions multiplied, and how the evil authorities piled decree on decree and followed expulsion with expulsion until there was no relief for Israel, they went out on the road and sought an answer from the paths of the wide world. Which is the correct road to traverse to find rest for their soul? Then a piece of paper fell from heaven, go to Polania, Poland, another name in Hebrew for Poland. So they came to the land of Polin, and they gave a mountain of gold to the king, and he received them with great honor. And God had mercy on them, so that they found favor from the king and the nobles. And the king gave them permission to reside in all the lands of his kingdom, to trade over its length and breadth, and to serve God according to the precepts of their religion. And the king protected them against every foe and enemy. And Israel lived in Polin in tranquility for a long time. They devoted themselves to trade and handicrafts, and God sent a blessing on them so that they were blessed in the land and that their name was exalted among the peoples. And they traded with the surrounding countries, and they also struck coins with inscriptions in the Holy Script and the language of the country. These are the coins which have on them a lion rampant from the right facing left. And on the coins are the words Mieszko, King of Poland, or Mieszko Król Polski. The Poles called their king Król. When they came from the land of the Franks, they found a forest in the land, and on every tree, one tractate of the Talmud was incised. This is the forest of Kavchin, which is near Lublin. And every man said to his neighbor, we have come to the land where our ancestors dwelt in ancient times for Torah and learning. And those who delve into the scriptures say, this is why it is called Polin. For thus spoke Israel when they came to the land. Here rest for the night, Polin. And this means that we shall rest here until we shall merit going to the land of Israel. If this is the tradition, we accept it. Now, Agnon, in the Nobel Prize edition of his stories, in the volume called Elu Va'elu, gives a slightly different ending to the same story. And we'll just read that last sentence here. And why is the land called Polin? The community of Israel said before the Holy One, blessed be he, Master of the world, if the time of my redemption has not yet come, Polin, stay here with us in this darkness of exile until you bring us to the land of Israel. Now, and here you can see the various editions of the story, first in the Hatkufa, the one on the left in Hebrew, and then the German, Das Buch von Polnischen Juden. During World War I, there was an increased interest in East European Jewry as German troops occupied most of Poland and came to meet Polish Jews in their quote-unquote natural habitat. And there was a great interest, both among Jews and non-Jews, about Polish Jewry. So it's not strange that the book was published during World War I. But let's look again at Agnon's story. What does it tell us about how Jews regarded their beginnings in that land? First of all, first and foremost, Poland as a refuge for persecuted Jews until the redemption. Poland as a paradisus Judaeorum, a paradise for Jews in the eyes of Jews and Gentiles alike. The story involves heavenly signs and omens, and especially emphasizes the special relations with the kings as guarantors of Jewish status against their foes, which meant, of course, that they did have foes. Jews had freedom of movement and trade and handicrafts. All of these things were not self-understood in other countries in Central or Western Europe at the time. And there was the archaeological evidence of Jewish presence, the so-called Jewish coins, which were with Hebrew letters, which we'll see a little bit later. Even more surprising in Agnon's story is the notion that the medieval settlement of Jews was actually a renewal of more ancient settlement. The Jews had actually lived in Poland from aforetime. And this is reflected in Jewish folklore from Eastern Europe in many different ways, such as the notion that the prophet Jeremiah was buried in a cemetery in Poland, or a student of Rabbi Meir, the Tana, or Rabbi Meir himself, was buried in the Lublin cemetery. And even the notion that in one Lithuanian town they celebrated Shushan Purim because they had a tradition that their town was walled from the time of Yehoshua bin Nun. And another thing is the notion of Poland as a center of Jewish learning, where literally the plants, the flora and fauna of the country reflected Jewish learning, the image of the forest. Poland as Jewish space. And finally, the very name of the country reflects a deep Jewish connection. And this notion of the special nature of Polin is exemplified by the special and wonderful museum in Warsaw, which is called simply Polin, subtitled The Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And the forest that we spoke about in the story of Agnon actually has its representation in the entryway to the museum, where you have a series of screens with trees. But what's special about it is the leaves keep dropping off the tree and slowly descend toward the bottom of the screen. And on each leaf, there is a sentence, either in English or in Polish, of Agnon's story about the origin of Polish Jewry. Now, this is not the only narrative and the only origin story about Polish Jewry. One thing we can say is that Jewish origin stories, whenever they exist, usually will try to emphasize how early Jewish settlement in a particular country was. Because otherwise Jews would always be the Johnny-come-latelys. They're not the natives. So Jewish counter-narratives would say, no, we were here from the beginning, along with everybody else. One of the most interesting ones is the story of Abraham Prochovnik, whose name means Abraham, at least is the way it's interpreted, Abraham the gunpowder maker, which makes it a little bit impossible to be in the 9th century. But he was the one who could have been king of Poland. It was said that when the king of Poland had died, the people gathered and could not decide who was going to be the new king. And so they said that let's have a kind of drawing of lots. The first person to come into the town in the morning, that person will be the king. And lo and behold, who was the first person to come into town that morning? It was this same Abraham Prochovnik, who was actually going to come to shul to daven shacharit. But in a minute, he found himself surrounded by everyone and saying, Yechi HaMelech, long live the king. And he says, well, wait a minute. No. This is not for me. And then according to one version or other of the story, he asked to be put up in a house and wait and think for 3 days before he decides to accept being king or not. And finally, by the end of the 3rd day, a young man by the name of Piast, who is very strong, said, we can't wait any longer. Poland needs a leader. He breaks down the door. And then Abraham Prochovnik says, you see, this is the one who should be the king. According to another version, a simpler version, less dramatic version, Abraham declines the honor of being king and says, I have a friend, Piast, who should be the king. And Piast is a 9th century legendary figure, the founder of the first major Polish dynasty. But what we have in this story is that Jews, in a sense, are equals from the very beginning to the fact that a Jew could be the king of Poland. Another origin story about Jewish origins and Jewish status in Poland, because remember, the story that Agnon tells talks about the special status that Jews had in the eyes of the kings and the nobles. There is the legend of Esterka, the mistress, the wife of Casimir the Great, who was the king of Poland in the mid-14th century. He was the last ruler of the Piast dynasty. And here, it actually starts out as a kind of anti-Semitic legend, namely that this Jewish woman bewitched the king, and that's why the king granted this charter of rights to the Jews that was so wide and so generous. In later generations, of course, people, both Jews and non-Jews, would adopt this legend, but from a positive and not necessarily negative view. Another less well-known origin story about Jewish rights and privileges in Poland is that Casimir had a Jewish banker and advisor whose name was Levko, or Leb, and he supposedly had a special ring with which he hypnotized the king. And in this way, he forced the king, due to a spell he cast on him, to give the Jews of Poland their special rights. We have two other traditions about Jews seeking to come to Poland. Both of them seem to be totally ahistorical. One of them, a rabbinic delegation to the Polish king in the year 894, 889, seeking refuge for Jews. And another of Jews wandering east from Spain after the expulsion, which of course is very, very late, after 1492. There were small numbers of Spanish Jews who came to Poland after the expulsion, but nothing like any major settlement, and certainly not the beginning of Jewish settlement in Poland. One of the earliest mentions of the Esterka legend is from one of the earliest Polish historians, a man named Jan Długosz. He's one of the first major Polish historians. And in his annals, he has the following story. When the king is told by one of the grooms that the Czech girl, whom he dearly loves and whose beauty has bewitched him, is bald and has the itch, he decides to see for himself. And finding out that it is indeed so, summarily dismisses her and replaces her with a woman of Jewish extraction, Hester. Here is Esther, another beauty. He has two sons by her, Niemieja and Pelka, and at her request signs a document granting all Jews living in the Kingdom of Poland unusual freedoms and privileges, which seriously offend the majesty of God and whose stench endures to this day. You can see his viewpoint about this. It has been alleged that this document was a forgery. Pelka dies an early natural death. Niemieja is killed in a fright over his father's death. What is disgraceful and damnable is that the king allowed his daughters by this Jewess to be brought up in the Jewish faith. So again, even through this very, very anti-Jewish attitude of Długosz, we have the story of Esterka, and also the fact that he doesn't find impossible that the king could have two sons and two daughters, and the two daughters could be brought up in the Jewish faith. But again, all this seems to be legend. Although the legend grew and grew and became subject of poems and plays and literary studies, and here I have on the screen some of them that were done in the 19th and 20th century, including the work of the late Professor Chona Szmeruk. And these dueling narratives reflect themselves also in art. So here on the left we have a picture of the king calling on Esterka in her family home, and another picture where Esterka's father is trying to talk her out of marrying the king. And there are other artistic versions of this, but it's certainly part of the legend and folklore of Polish Jewry and of Poland, to the point that there are Esterka's houses in at least 3 Polish cities. Here I gave a picture of the Esterka house in Radom, but there are pictures of others. All scholars of architecture agree that the 3 houses that were supposedly Esterka's house in this town or that town did not belong to the period when Esterka was supposed to have lived in, but rather from much later. But for the Nazis, that was not enough to prove that this was not really Esterka's house, and so this particular house in Radom, for example, the Germans destroyed because it was associated with the so-called Jewish Queen of Poland, and they wanted to erase every memory of her. Only after the war, the house was reconstructed, and this is the way it looks now. Now, there are several theories of origin among scholars about where did Polish Jews come from? Besides the nice story about wandering and the Petek, the note falling from heaven, etc., we might divide them into Western hypotheses versus Southern and Eastern hypotheses. Jews coming to Poland from the West, which is much more likely, and Jews coming to Poland from the South or from the East. And these are usually called by the following names. First, the so-called Canaan hypothesis, which we'll explain, the trade route theory, the Khazar theory, and what seems most likely, migrations from Ashkenaz and Central Europe. We have to realize that in all of this discussion, there is more than a little guesswork trying to build a picture from a small number of documents, a small number of historical findings. We don't have real documentation of migrants, Jewish migrants, into Poland from east or west. The Canaan hypothesis, Canaan was the Hebrew word that was used for the Slavs. And since we're at the time of beginnings in the reading of the Torah, in last week's Torah portion, we read about Canaan being a slave. And Jews called the Slavs Canaan because they supposedly sold their own people into slavery. But what do we have? We have in rabbinic works a series of Slavic glosses that they claim reflected the living languages of Jews in Eastern Europe, not exactly clear when, and that later Yiddish absorbed some of these words and the syntax as migrants from Ashkenaz overwhelmed the original Jewish inhabitants. And of course, there is evidence of Jewish presence in the area, in the region, particularly in the region of Kiev, in Kievan Rus, where we know about Jewish communities in Kiev in the 11th and 12th century. And it's possible, certainly, that some Jews moved west from that area into Poland. Again, we don't have any documentation of that. The trade route theory talks about the notion that Jews as international traders moving along the trade routes from Central and Western toward Eastern Europe and finding places that regarded as hospitable, they might have settled down. But what's most important here is a testimony that we have from a Spanish Jew by the name of Ibrahim ibn Yaqub from the year 965 or 966. And I note for you the importance of the year 966 because in Polish history, the year 966 is also an important year because it's the year when Poland accepted Christianity as the national faith. So at the very beginning, in a sense, we have a Jewish testimony about the land of the Poles and the Slavs, probably the first that we have from anyone talking about Poland, and it's just from the time when Poland's history begins. So again, I stress for you the notion that these origin stories are always trying to look for the earliest possible examples. Say, Jews, we've been here the whole time. We came, we're like the story about the forest. We're rediscovering a place where we had lived before. Like the story of Abraham Prachownik, we're here from the beginning of Polish kingship, and a Jew could have been king. And here, Ibrahim ibn Yaqub gives his first testimony, and he says the lands of the Slavs stretch from the Syrian Sea to the ocean in the north. They comprise numerous tribes, each different from the other. At present, there are 4 kings: the king of the Bulgars, Boleslav, king of Faraga, Bohemia, and Karako, which is probably Kraków, Mieszko, king of the north, and Nakon on the border of the west. As far as the realm of Mieszko is concerned, and this is one of the first Polish kings, this is the most extensive of their lands. It produces an abundance of food, meat, honey, and fish. The taxes collected by the king from commercial goods are used for the support of his retainers. He keeps 3,000 armed men divided into detachments. And he gives a whole description about the married life, sexual life, the way people are treated, and also about the weather, the climate, all of this in this testimony, this unique testimony of Ibrahim ibn Yaqub. Another example often cited about the trade route theory are some sculptures on churches. Here, St. Wojciech Adalbert bringing Jewish slave traders before Prince Boleslav in the Cathedral of Gniezno in western Poland around the year 1170. We're trying to figure out when exactly can we talk about a Jewish community in Poland. Of course, we could also say that these traders were just passing through, collecting the slaves, and then going back to Western Europe or Southern Europe. So we just don't know, but this is another piece of evidence that people sometimes use for the trade route theory. In the same way, we have the discussion about Judita, the princess of Władysław of Poland, who before her death bequeathed a large amount of money to free poor people and prisoners and those who have been held, Christians held in slavery by Jews. But again, does this mean that there were Jews in the country, Jews passing through, and her good deed before her death was to redeem these Christian slaves from the Jewish slaveholders? And this is from the year 1085. A theory that was popular for quite a while and pops up every once in a while is the so-called Khazar theory. That the Khazar kingdom, according to a legend, became Jewish or partially Jewish, and it was a kind of Jewish empire. And when this empire collapsed, refugees fled in different directions, including west towards Poland, and settled in Poland, so that part of the beginning of the Jewish community in Poland was refugees from Khazaria. Now, this theory has its both political and apologetic uses. Just to give 3 examples, in the partition debate in the United Nations in 1947, the Indian delegate, India had just gotten its own independence, said in the debate that the Jews of today do not deserve any claim, biblical claim, to the land of Israel, because the Jews of today are all descendants of the Khazars, so that any claim they have to the land of Israel is null and void. Arthur Koestler, toward the end of his life, published a book which created quite a stir, again called The 13th Tribe. Koestler's goal in promoting the Khazar theory was to create a cure for anti-Semitism. If the Jews of today are descended from the Khazars and not from the Jews of the Bible and not from the Jews at the time of the New Testament, so they had nothing to do with the death of Jesus, and therefore anti-Semitism doesn't make any sense. And in recent years, Shlomo Zand, who has published a number of controversial works, has again revived the Khazar theory to say that the Jews of today, again, have no claim to the land of Israel. All of this is an invented tradition, and so forth and so on. But the very notion that the Khazar nation, in part or in whole, became Jewish has been refuted quite seriously by Professors Moshe Gil and Shaul Stampfer, who's a close relative of our hostess this evening. And therefore, if there is no Jewish kingdom, so again, there are no Jewish refugees. So the Khazar theory does not really hold much water. There have been other attempts to justify this through genetics, or we might say pseudogenetics, which also do not really hold water. And here again, Khazar theory, there is a Khazar Studies website, a lot of interest in the Khazars. But what seems to be the most likely explanation as to where Jews came from, coming to Poland, was from the West, most likely from the near West, that is, the neighboring lands of what is today Czechia, Slovakia, Austria, partially from Germany. And this is part of a larger phenomenon of migration east, especially after the Mongol invasion, which destroyed large parts of Eastern Europe. The Mongols were stopped only in the 1240s at the border of Germany and then retreated into Asia. But after that, the cities of Poland needed to be rebuilt. The country needed to be rebuilt. And therefore, there was a need for migration. And there was not just one wave of migration, but many waves of migration, Jews and non-Jews. And we have ethnic groups of many kinds finding their way to Poland, whether it be Scots, Italians, Armenians, even Muslims finding their way into Poland at different periods. One way of charting the eastward migration of Jews is the eastward migration of the charters of Jewish rights that Jews were given in different countries to guarantee their rights and privileges within the feudal system which was existent in Europe at that time. Another connection that Jews had with the West was with some of the rabbis of Ashkenaz, and there's some evidence that these rabbis of Ashkenaz had authority, were regarded as authorities by the Jews, the Jewish communities in Poland. Another thing is name patterns. The names of Jews in Poland are similar to the names of Jews in Central and Western Europe. In the same way, the migration of the Yiddish language. The Yiddish language would undergo change through the influence of the Slavic environment, but nevertheless it was Yiddish that moved eastward. And in fact, that even if we say that there were some leftovers of the eastern or southern migrations, those communities either were wiped out during the Mongol invasion or had very, very few survivors, so that the real Jewish community of Poland is coming from the West. And again, art has its part in this discussion. Jan Matejko, who is regarded as the kind of national historic painter of Poland in the 19th century, and in many ways both the preserver and promoter of a certain version of Polish history, trying to keep Polish national identity alive, he painted a painting which he called The Admission of the Jews to Poland 1096, which is certainly not historical, connecting it to the Crusades. So we don't have Jewish refugees fleeing the Crusades and coming to Poland. But what's important not only is the date, but also the way the Jews are portrayed. Matejko is portraying the Jews as wildly gesticulating Oriental figures. None of these things are considered to be complimentary in the late 19th century. And they're begging and pleading down on their knees as the king considers their request. And Matejko will return in our second and third lectures, again talking about the relation between Poles and Jews in Poland. And he is the major painter of Polish historical scenes, so it will be important to go back to him. Now, one clear piece of evidence that always is used in talking about dating Jewish communities is cemeteries and tombstones. And the oldest extant tombstone that was found in Poland is from Wrocław, dated from the year 1203. Now, there may have been others older, but this one survived, so at least it gives us at least a date around which there must have been some kind of community to the point where the Jews had a cemetery. And regarding rabbinic authorities, we have from the early 13th century a letter from Rabbi Eliezer of Bohemia to Rabbi Yehuda Chassid of Regensburg, who was the founder of the so-called Hasidei Ashkenaz. And he writes about the situation of the Jewish communities, the small and young Jewish communities in Eastern Europe. And he notes the fact that the Shliach Tzibur, the people who were the chazan, the mohel, the teacher, they weren't being paid enough. And so they would have a collection on Simchat Torah and on Purim to help supplement their salary. And he begs Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, don't abolish this. Don't forbid this Purim collection and the donations for Simchat Torah and the donations for weddings. Because in most of the communities in Poland, Russia, and Hungary, here Russia usually means what we call Galicia, not Russia, where out of their poverty there are no learned people, and they hire whomever they can find among them. And he functions as Shliach Tzibur, as the Chazan, Moreh Tzedek, the decider of Jewish law, and a teacher of their sons. And they promise him all these funds. And if you abolish them, their salary will be insufficient and they will leave these posts, and the Kehilot will be left without Torah, without prayer, and without religious rulings. So again, we're focusing in on the beginning of the 13th century as the time when it looks like a Jewish community in Poland is beginning to gel. We have no idea of numbers, but here you can see the communities are small and poor. Here are the coins that we talked about before in Agnon's story, which seem to be from the late 12th and early 13th century once again. And if you look at the coin on the right, it says indeed, Mashka Król Polski in Hebrew letters. What was the function of these coins? Again, it's not clear. Were they coins of the realm or not? The jury is still out regarding this. But again, it shows a Jewish presence in Poland, again, the end of the 12th, beginning of the 13th century. And here Arthur Szyk, in his famous series of paintings called the Statute of Kalisz from 1928, here shows the Jews, again, making the coins. But to go back again to the point of the privilegia, the so-called charters of rights, we see, if you look at the dates, they're kind of small here on the screen, but if you look at the dates, you can see them slowly moving eastward till we get to Poland and the Charter of Boleslav of Kalisz, the one at the top in the middle, from the year 1264. So certainly a Jewish community that has a charter is already a Jewish community, a recognized Jewish community. It may have been there for 50 years before, but now its status is about to be regularized. And again, Szyk showing all the different professions of the Jews in Poland, and the king on the right granting the rights to the Jews. But I think what's important is to look how the Jews and others regard Jewish status in their own eyes and in the eyes of others. We have the testimony of a papal diplomat from 1565 visiting Poland, and he says, in those principalities, one still comes upon masses of Jews who are not disdained as much as in other such lands. So the status of Jews is different. They do not live here under pitiful conditions and do not engage in lowly pursuits, but rather they possess land, engage in commerce, and devote themselves to medicine and astrology. Now, some of these things will undergo change in the next century, particularly about Jews owning land, where the nobles would push again and again to preserve their specific exclusive right to lands other than the church and the king, of course. The Jews possess considerable wealth, and they are not only among the respectable citizens, but occasionally dominate them. They wear no special marks to distinguish themselves from Christians, and are even permitted to wear swords and go about armed. In general, they enjoy equal rights. Now, there may be some exaggeration in this, but there's a great deal of reality reflected in this testimony by this papal diplomat. First of all, the notion that Jews wear no special marks. The church, despite its many efforts, was never successful in imposing the so-called Jewish badge on Jews in Poland. There were no ghettos in Poland. And except for a few isolated instances, there were no expulsions of Jews from Poland. So the situation of the Jews in Poland relatively was much better than that in other countries. We have the testimony of Rabbi Moshe Isserles, known as the Ramah, who was asked by a student who was offered a rabbinical post in Germany, should he take it? Should he leave Poland and take the rabbinical post in Germany? And Moshe Isserles responded, perhaps we ought to prefer a piece of dry bread in peace in these lands, where the hatred of Jews has not taken the dimensions of that in German lands. May God allow this condition to continue until the coming of the Messiah. So on the one hand, the Ramah talks about how the situation of Jews in Poland is so much superior to that of Germany, but he adds the caveat that, well, let's pray that it continues to be so. Around the same time, the Karaite scholar Isaac of Troki, in his book Chizuk Emunah, which is a kind of anti-Christian polemic, in his introduction he says, the kings and nobles of these lands, may God increase their well-being, love kindness and justice, and do not wrong or oppress Jews living in their country. It would be very hard to find testimonies such as these from other countries in Central or Western Europe in those times. I call this history, memory, myth, and politics, and this is an ongoing process. 6 years ago, there was a major conference celebrating the opening of the Museum of Polish Jews in Warsaw. And note the title of the conference, From Ibrahim ibn Yaqub to 6th on 11th Street. 6th on 11th Street is the address of the museum in Warsaw. But where does Polish Jewish history start? Where does the Polish Jewish story start? With Ibrahim ibn Yaqub in 966. Now these issues are open to discussion. There have been numerous articles. I mentioned my friend and colleague Shaul Stampfer before, and he also wrote some articles about how and when the Jews came to Poland, what was the process. And the last word has certainly not been said. But this is an ongoing international conversation. And part of it is the notion of where the Jews fit in Poland. Are the Jews part of Poland? Is Poland part of the Jews? And that goes back to my 3 terms at the very beginning with which I called this series: the stranger, the neighbor, citizen. Where and how the Jews fit into 1, 2, all 3 of these rubrics. And this notion of Polish Jewish history in its fullness, and you notice I didn't say the word Holocaust once yet, because that's very important. There are hundreds and hundreds of years of Polish Jewish history before the destruction of almost all of Polish Jews in the Holocaust. And those centuries deserve our scholarly and popular interest no less than the last tragic years of Polish Jewry. And the present and future of Polish Jewry, because there is a Polish Jewish community today, led by Rabbi Michael Schudrich. And they also look for their place in Poland in different ways, and that place in Poland has been challenged. If you go to the internet, many internet sites will talk about how Jews are strangers in Poland. Jews are enemies of Poland. Jews are the ultimate other of Poland. And they're not even talking about the tiny Jewish community. They're talking about the Jew, the image of the Jew, which is still important in Polish national consciousness. I'm not saying that all of them regard the Jews this way, but many of them do to this day. This is an ongoing process. We mentioned the term before, Paradisus Judaeorum, a paradise for Jews. And lo and behold, only a few months ago, a Polish scholar by the name of Piotr Konieczny published an article talking about the history of this term, Paradisus Judaeorum, paradise for Jews. And he found that the very first mention of this is in an anonymous Latin poem from 1606, when it clearly is anti-Jewish. And he says here, Regnum Polonorum est, the kingdom of Poland is paradise for Jews, hell for the peasants, and purgatory for the townspeople. And there are other versions of this, adding other groups in Polish society, but this notion of Poland, that the Jews had it too good. And that's the complaint here. The Jews have it too good in Poland. And this particular gallery in the Polin Museum, the 16th, 17th century gallery, is entitled Paradisus Judaeorum. And there was no small amount of debate among the museum staff and directors and other scholars whether this was the right thing to do, to use this term, whether out of a sense of seriousness, out of a sense of irony, or a little bit of both. But there is something special about the Jewish status in Poland that is unlike that in other countries. Now we come to the end of our presentation, and very often you will hear the term 1,000 years of Polish Jewish life. 1000 Jor Polen. Here, Elef Shnot Chaim Yehudiim Bepolin, this pamphlet that was published. So, is it 1,000 years? Was it a paradise? How does legend versus reality match up? Well, first of all, we're in the 21st century, so we're getting a little closer to the 1,000 years. But in the 20th century, it was not yet 1,000 years. It was closer to 800 years. The legends that we spoke about from the beginning of our talk this evening are not historically accurate, but do reflect later relatively positive conditions for Jews in Poland. Poland may have not been a paradise for Jews, but while Jews had adversaries, they also had allies and protectors, whether the kings or the nobles, against the church and the burghers, later on the guilds. Jews had some protections. And these rights, these charters, the ones for Poland, that's point number 3 here, the legal status of Jews in Poland had significant upgrades compared to charters in other countries. The Charter of Boleslav of Kalisz in 1264 specifically denounces the blood libel, which had only recently appeared, and the Pope, Innocent IV, had also denounced the blood libel. But it's written in there, Jews may not be accused of using Christian blood. There also is a unique paragraph in that charter of Boleslav of Kalisz. For those of us who might remember New York in the 1960s, we might call this the Kitty Genovese clause, which says that if a Jew calls out in the night and his Gentile neighbors don't come to his aid and assistance, they can be fined heavily. And there are other examples in here where the clauses are significantly more generous than that what existed in other countries. So the charters moved to the east, but Poland upgraded them in many different ways. And we have to say that these early days, these early centuries, set the basis for Jewish life in Poland in centuries to come, when Jewish autonomy in Poland would reach heights unknown in diaspora history, at least since the time of the exilarchs in Babylonia. And demographically, Poland would eventually become the largest community in Europe. So there's a long history. It has a beginning, excuse me, maybe shrouded in legend, but that legend reflects a reality. And the further chapters in Polish Jewish history, not all of which we will be able to cover in our coming lectures, will show how those foundations developed, expanded, sometimes were attacked, but became part of a Polish Jewish life whose importance lives on to this day. I thank you all for your attention, and now open for questions.
Thank you very much, Gershon. That was fascinating. We have a few questions here, and a few might more come up, but Wendy's asking, she said, if word got around that Poland was a good place for Jews, why didn't Jews from Spain and Portugal come to Poland after the Inquisition?
Well, as I said, some did, but they were more attracted to the Mediterranean basin, where they had their trade contacts and others, and they found a welcome refuge in the Ottoman Empire and in places in Italy. So Poland seemed far off, although there were attempts to establish some Sephardic communities in Poland, and some Sephardic Jews did come to Poland to serve as royal physicians and things like that. But by the time 1492, it still looked, I guess, to a Spanish Jew, Poland probably still looked a little primitive.
What are the origins of anti-Semitism in Poland? Is it rooted in Christian beliefs regarding the killing of Jesus, or are there other forces at work here?
Well, that's a big question, but certainly you saw when Długosz, if I can go back to him for a second, when he said about Esterka, talked about this was an offense to God and man. What did he say? Wait a minute, I'll get to it. He says, the unusual freedoms and privileges which seriously offend the majesty of God and whose stench endures to this day. I mean, that's pretty anti-Jewish, but it's clearly rooted in Christian belief. But the Jew is also, how should I put it, part of the landscape, and would become part of the landscape of Poland. So that there is anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews. Anti-Semitism is a modern term. There is modern anti-Semitism in Poland, which we'll talk about next time and the time afterwards. But there is competition between traders, burghers, townspeople, and Jews competing for the same jobs, competing for the same trade routes, and oftentimes they're successful in keeping the Jews out. I said before, in Poland there were no ghettos. There is one, however, specific Polish phenomenon, and that's that a few cities, very few cities, got a right from the king to non tolerantis Judaeis, to not allow Jews to live within them. Most markedly Danzig, Gdańsk. But there were some certain others where Jews were not allowed to live within the town limits. Of course, Jews found their way around this by living in the areas owned by nobles around the city, and the nobles would allow Jews to go and live there. So even if they weren't allowed to live in the city, they could get there, and also during the trade fairs, Jews were allowed to come into cities where they were not allowed to live. So there is social competition, there is economic competition, there is religious enmity, and we could say, as things developed, national enmity. When modern nationalism develops, one of the questions would be, can a Jew be a Pole? And if a Jew cannot be a Pole, does a Jew belong in Poland altogether? So Polish anti-Semitism is not something which is, automatic. It's not, as the Ramah said, it's not as bad as it was in Germany. So, you have testimony from the period saying that the hatred of Jews is not as bad as it was in Germany. So Jews had protection, Jews had rivals, Jews had enemies, but they made their way.
Okay, we have quite a few questions. I'll take one or two more, and I'm apologizing, we won't be able to answer all the questions. Are Polish scholars interested in why Jews got to Poland, or is that a question which is relevant only to Jewish researchers?
That's an interesting question. I think that these days, we can't make a distinction. The young cadre of young Polish scholars are dealing with every aspect of Polish Jewish history, from very abstruse issues of Hasidic theology to economic history to political history. It's very difficult to make a distinction between Polish and Jewish Polish scholars. But there is interest in this topic, and because it's part of the question of how Poland was built up as a country. If you talk about the building of the urban middle class and you leave out the Jews, then you're leaving out a big part of the picture. And I think Polish scholars of the present generation realize that and are engaged in such issues themselves.
Okay, I think we're going to take a last question here. This is from David Lee. So Ukrainians explain their hate to Jews by saying that Jews were being used by Poles as rent collectors of Polish property. What is your take on this?
Well, that's talking about the period of 1648 and pre-1648. Jews were working as so-called arrendars. They leased estates, and part of their job was collecting rents and taxes and other things from the peasants, and even having the ability to punish the peasants. There was no love lost between Jews and the Ukrainians, or I don't know if they called themselves Ukrainians in those days yet, but the people in the eastern territories, which were ruled by Poland, where Poles were a small minority and Jews also a small minority. When there was the uprising, both Poles and Jews suffered. Both Poles and Jews tried to defend themselves, and both Poles and Jews were killed. But you can't just blame it on that one thing of the rents. There was a lot of accumulated enmity from a lot of things, for religious, national, economic, political reasons, that the Jews suffered so much during the 1648 to 1649 massacres. But that's a topic for another lecture, which is not in this series.
Okay, well, it's always good to leave a taste for more. I think we're going to end here, and thank you very much, Professor Bacon, for this lecture. And we invite everyone to continue moving on in history and for the next sessions on the Jews in Poland. And you'll be getting, it's the same link, and you'll be also getting emails to remind you to join us. Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody.
Thank you to all.